I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.
We've been offering low cost financial assistance for cities and towns for really nearly 40 years, starting in the early 90s. The bank has always been a source of low cost financing for communities to help improve their drinking water and wastewater systems.
This week, I had an amazing conversation with Bill Fazioli about how we can reduce our risk from climate by improving the resilience of our infrastructure, something we can only do by making the financing available for it. In our discussion this week, Bill and I talked through the mechanisms of doing so and how to use what we call infrastructure banks to make it possible.
William Fazioli, the executive director of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank.
One of the things that Bill Fazioli has done and that their administration has done is to say, okay, Rhode Island, small state, important state, but also a state with incredible coastline and exposures to flooding, both at the coastal level and through rivers, and exposures to other kinds of extreme weather.
We took that model and said, let's just bring that to the resiliency world so communities can start thinking about climate adaptation projects, mitigation projects that could help them build in the infrastructure. I think our whole idea here is that there's more money we can put into the pre-disaster mitigation benefit. It'll have a high return on investment, and then it will minimize the post-disaster recovery costs. I think ultimately that's what we want to see.
He's recognized that the infrastructure we need for today is in part resilient infrastructure. We need infrastructure that's resilient to the increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme weather that we're experiencing across the country and that states like Rhode Island are experiencing today. So they've used an institution that had been developed for creating other kinds of infrastructure, and they're now starting to apply it to creating resilient infrastructure. What they've done, which is really interesting, is they work with the state. The state raises funds through a bond issuance. So states are able to raise capital relatively inexpensively. That capital is then put into the infrastructure bank. The infrastructure bank then, through an application process, communities can raise their hand and say, look, we have a critical piece of infrastructure that we think really needs to be made more resilient. This is our approach for doing it. This is what we think it would cost, and this is how we think it would create economic benefits to us as a community in the future. Bill is working with an infrastructure bank. The infrastructure bank then funds some subset of those projects. The communities carry those out. They go ahead and get the planning, they get the engineers to do the work, they get the developers to actually implement the projects, and then they will pay back the capital that they got from the infrastructure bank at a below market rate of interest. So it's better for the community than it would have been if they had gone straightforwardly to the market, but it also increases the pool of total funds that are available for other communities to carry out their own resilience projects into the future. An infrastructure bank is an idea that really came out of the Reagan administration. So it's now 40 some odd years old. And it was an effort by folks in the Reagan administration to say, we should enable local decision making for allocation of funds. And so an infrastructure bank enables local communities within a state to kind of raise the funds they need to create the infrastructure that they think is important. They anticipate that over the decades to come, it can do billions of dollars worth of projects as this fund continues to grow.
We're in Rhode Island, little old Rhode Island, in part of the New England region, a small state with a very large coastline, an older industrial state. So we have a lot of old mill towns, and a lot of densely populated cities, a fair amount of rural areas as well, but most of the population lives in the metropolitan region in some older, dense urban areas as well. Part of New England, most of the rivers had mill sites that were on that powered the mills back then. A lot of those mills have been converted to residential units as well now. When the flood happens, it has a big impact on people who are living in those low-lying areas. When people think of weather events, most people equate that to like hurricanes and think that we haven't had a major hurricane impact in many years in Rhode Island, but the increased pace of significant weather-related events that are driving floods, inland flooding, and coastal erosion has really been the biggest things impacting Rhode Island communities. It's really about how communities are now trying to devise ways to deal with the impact of climate change, more increasing storm events that are impacting neighborhoods, their cities, their streets, their coastlines, and all of that. I think starting several years ago, communities were seeing a larger pace of weather-related events that were impacting their communities. They really didn't have an ability to help finance any improvements that could mitigate those issues.
Yeah, increasing weather events. People want to address this, but at a community level, there's really no tools to be able because these can be expensive, right? We can talk about need to move infrastructure. We could talk about raising bridges, new roads, new walls, new nature-based solutions. These can be expensive things to put in place, and there's a need to finance these.
Exactly, and communities have a significant number of budget challenges already, dealing with maintaining normal operations for public safety and education. So when you have to add in the expense of providing for investments in infrastructure, they have to deal with certain constraints. And we find that our financing vehicles can be very helpful for them to help plan for these major projects and do it at a financial pace that makes sense for them.
So, can you walk us through what is it you're doing? What is it you're offering communities in Rhode Island?
Yeah, we've been offering low cost financial assistance for cities and towns for really nearly 40 years. The bank has always been a source of low cost financing for communities to help improve their drinking water and wastewater systems. And we took that model and said, let's just bring that to the resiliency world so communities can start thinking about climate adaptation projects, mitigation projects that could help them build in the infrastructure at a way that doesn't necessarily impact their budget too significantly all at once, where they can amortize the cost of these projects over 20, 30 years. Our rates that we offer communities are below market rate. Sometimes they're between 2 and 3%, which is very affordable. In addition, we also provide technical assistance to grants to communities, which are generally free technical assistance where they can go out and hire an engineering firm to help them identify a series of solutions that may make sense in their particular community.
So, can you walk us through like what's an example kind of project that you might think of?
The first one we started with the town of Bristol, Rhode Island, which is a coastal community, the beautiful harbor, susceptible to sea level rise. And also in this part of town, there's a creek that empties into the bay, and it goes over an area which is really the main thoroughfare into the downtown central business district of Bristol. A significant storm will come in, the creek will flood, and that'll create a major amount of water volume flowing out under the bridge, and at the same time, the storm will bring water into the bridge area as the tide's coming in. So we're working with the town where they're literally raising the roadway to mitigate the flooding. Because if that area floods consistently, there's really no way for people to leave that area. They would have to almost head south and leave the area altogether. We've provided them some financing where they're doing some engineering and eventually we'll raise the bridge to allow for less flooding and easier access to the area and during heavy weather events.
So, this is Bristol, Rhode Island. This is literally the postcard picture of if you're thinking about a quaint New England waterfront community, and the same infrastructure that makes it so charming is now fragile in the face of some of this increasing extreme weather, especially this flooding.
Right, yeah, this is their main downtown area, restaurants, residential, they have community parks and things of that nature, so it's a really cherished area of the town. It's very picturesque, especially in the summer and the spring months. It's home to the I think the oldest continuous 4th of July parade in the country, so it's a very significant piece to the city's history, but they have to take steps to safeguard that, and then, we had to create a new loan program that could accommodate this project. Because prior to this, we really didn't have a program that could qualify for this type of work. Normally, our funding was for strictly a project that would deal with wastewater or drinking water. So this is a resiliency project, didn't really fit into any of our buckets. So we had to develop a new financing program and devote some capital to make this possible.
And how big a project is it to raise the level of a bridge?
The initial phase one is about $2.5 million, which is a big lift for a local community. That's a big number. That'll be done over the course of a couple of years, but we'll have to see how that manages itself over the next several years. They're working with folks designing the bridge so it can maintain itself over different scenarios, dealing with sea level rise and flooding particular. It's something that it might not sound like a significant amount of money, but the town is in a position to come up with that kind of financing on its own if it wasn't for this external funding opportunity that we have.
Yeah, and so they're able to then borrow that money from you, put that to work to have the bridge built, and then pay back those fees with kind of a lower than market rate of
Yeah,
interest.
yeah, I think the rate on that was less than 3%, but the idea of that is that as that money comes back to us, to the bank, that gives us a new source of capital to provide other funding to other communities. The state has just finished a coastal resiliency study that has identified a number of areas that are vulnerable around the state. It's going to be finalized at the end of February, but there's hundreds, literally hundreds of public assets and examples like I just described in Bristol or around the state that could use this type of financing. So we need to develop a financing system that can achieve scale and can be a reliable source of funding for the long term and not just for a short period of time.
And for a state like Rhode Island, what is scale? How much money needs to be available for financing these kind of
Yeah,
projects?
so the initial estimates from the climate study that was the coastal study that was completed puts it in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. We're starting off with about $10 million in our fund right now. There's a bond referendum that's being proposed by the governor to include another $20 million into that fund that will be brought to the voters in November of 2026. And because of the power of leveraging how we are able to send the money out and have it come back to us, we can make a dollar support $3 worth of projects. It's not 100% going to complete the fit the financing needs, but it's a big part of the puzzle. We hope there's other financing that comes in through other mechanisms, but we just wanted to get this program up and running and evolve it and expand it as necessary as we see fit.
Remarkable. And so the state's gonna borrow the money through a bond at
Right.
kind of its lowered cost of borrowing, pass that savings through you onto many of these towns.
Exactly. Yeah.
And because then each community that borrows the money pays back, but pays back with some degree of interest. That money keeps growing, so the more communities can have access to the financing that they need to.
Yeah, like on our clean water and drinking water programs that have been around since the early 90s, this model has worked very successfully. We've provided nearly $3 billion worth of financing for those type of projects over the 30 or 40 years that we've been doing this, just because of the compounding nature of the funds as they come back and recycle themselves. And we want to, so starting it off with 20 million might not sound like a lot. 20, 30 years from now, it could easily get into the billions once the financing starts moving through the communities and back to the bank and back to the communities and so on.
Wow, that's remarkable. And so you're really taking a set of infrastructure and tools that we built in the 20th century and now saying, okay, these are the challenges of the 21st century that we're facing, and how do we start to adapt them and make them available for communities?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a very proven vehicle around the country. A number of states have revolving loan funds. Not many have them specifically for resiliency projects. I think we're going to be one of the first, which is great. But I think that a number of communities will be looking at this model as a way to approach it. Not being 100% funding, but be a big part of it. Right now, folks are looking at the commercial insurance industry, how they could possibly participate in a community-wide fund to help reduce risk and absorb some of these costs that benefit their clients as well.
And one of the interesting characteristics of this is that you're mobilizing capital at scale. So at the state level, you're borrowing tens of millions of dollars
Right.
and then deploying it collaboratively with communities through their decision-making process about what they think is really a priority, what's really important to them in these much smaller increments, and then doing it in ways that's collaborative amongst communities as well, because they each get to benefit from the
Mhm.
payoff that they.
Yeah, it's a very collaborative model, and also it allows them to customize their own solutions. Part of the planning process that we do with this resiliency program is that communities do sit through community-wide workshop where they identify where their priorities are at the local level. So we're not telling them where to spend or how to spend the money. It's largely a local decision. We're really there just for the financing piece. Most communities are really looking at this as something they need to do just to protect their tax base, because if they're dealing with constant damages to private property, their tax bases will be diminished, which in turn will undermine their fiscal conditions.
Yeah, and so what kind of project do you imagine? So bridges, I imagine you'll see many more bridges.
We're doing a lot of drainage and flood mitigation, stormwater utility, coastal erosion prevention, like slope stabilization projects. We have a lot of communities that are dealing with shorelines losing land, so there's ways to build nature-based solutions to slow down that erosion as well. We wanted to have a very broad area of eligible projects. We work with entities like the Nature Conservancy, the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management to make sure that these solutions are sustainable and they're not just stopgap measures, that they're really something that's going to be there for the long term.
That's fascinating. And as you're doing it, you're also starting to create the demand for a whole new set of services. Increasingly, people are recognizing, okay, well, we need to have the know-how, the capabilities to actually deploy things like these nature-based solutions. We need to learn how to do it, and if we do it, there are going to be potentially customers.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of engineering firms that are involved in helping to design, but ultimately a lot of construction firms that are doing the actual work. And I think the fact that we have a financing program that's up and running or is about in the phases of will be financing projects relatively soon, people will devote more time towards the planning for these projects if they know if there's financing that's likely. A lot of times, folks won't spend a lot of time doing a lot of analysis if they don't think it's a viable project. But the fact that the financing piece associated with it, I think that'll lead to more, hopefully, regional planning for these type of solutions and cooperative programs among the communities. A big thing is a little bit of hesitancy to devote a lot of time or energy unless they know that it is a solution and a practical solution for them to deal with. And a lot of times we tend to get overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. What are we going to do? But I think a lot of communities are moving into that mobilization phase where they want to move into implementation because there is a big market that can help finance this. As we expand the program, we'll be looking to perhaps issue more bonds to expand the program. The municipal bond market has been an extremely valuable partner in helping communities meet infrastructure needs for over a century. And we think that resiliency projects will be received by investors.
And are you seeing an increase in interest in moving into the resilience like services space in Rhode Island, or is this a kind of growing?
Yeah, we have a very big stakeholder group of local stakeholders, nature-based groups, and environmental groups, conservation groups, and also the building and trades community industry is looking to see this as a opportunity to expand their employment opportunities for their members because at the end of the day, this is really just nuts and bolts infrastructure. A lot of the stuff that's beneath the surface that people don't see, but needs to be in place to keep people safe from these rising threats.
As you just talk about things that people don't see, I think that there's also there amongst our civic institutions, there's a growing set that are really at the frontier of dealing with how communities are confronting kind of extreme weather events. And we're seeing it in different geographies across the country. And I'm not sure that it's easy for people to always appreciate the extent to which some of these very large, long-term threats are being addressed actively by the kind of civic institutions that we have in communities.
Yeah, we try to highlight projects that we have funded in the past, smaller scale projects like projects that are maybe 250,000 or $500,000, and we do are able to establish that these type of projects make sense, they make economic sense, they make engineering sense, and that created sort of that spark for communities to start thinking more boldly in their approach to solve some of these problems. As public policy takes several evolutions to evolve to a point where it's again it achieves that critical mass. And I think we're there at Rhode Island. We're very excited about what this new program can offer our clients.
That's great to hear. Do you have peer groups that you look to who are doing this something similar in different geographies?
I know Vermont, they have a lot of inland flooding, significant inland flooding because of the rivers. Virginia, being a coastal state, has a program up and running. They have a statewide program, and I believe the city of Norfolk has a very ambitious program as well. And there's a number of other, the Pew Center has a group of resiliency officers that meet every quarter. So it's becoming a very common point where people are gathering and discussing. More significantly, a lot of communities do get their communities rated from a credit point of view, either from a Moody's or a Standard& and Poor's or a Fitch. And more, we're seeing that the rating reports are doing some sort of assessment about the vulnerability of communities are for climate risk. In New England, we've seen a number of coastal communities literally lose properties, houses that just fall into the bay or the ocean, that were oceanfront properties that eventually get swept away as the tide continues to come in.
Wow, that is amazing. And kind of where do you see this going in the future? What kind of projects? How does it grow? How large does it get to be?
Typically, these type of funds start off relatively small, but eventually I see us being able to handle a project that's up to 20 or 30 or $40 million, maybe 5 or 10 years from now, once the cash flows start coming back and getting recirculated. Again, we have some regional problems that one individual community probably can't solve. A lot of times, these inland flooding issues have multiple communities that have to put in a solution. I think we'd love to have the program follow the chart of our clean water program that again is done in the billions of dollars of financing over the years. We probably take some time, but we think eventually if we stay the course will have that type of capacity.
That's fascinating to hear. And in doing this work, how much more resilient will communities be? How do you start thinking about the increased resilience of communities across Rhode Island as a result of this?
Yeah, I think our whole idea here is that is more money we can put into the pre-disaster mitigation benefit, it'll have a high return on investment, and then it will minimize the post-disaster recovery costs. I think ultimately that's what we want to see. We want to see communities save money by taking steps to minimize the damage of these events so that they're not spending 10 times more money in the recovery or trying to make up for lost vet property values and all of that. So I think that's really what we want to do. Ultimately, it comes down to a fiscal issue that some smart investments will pay off for themselves in the long run.
And so this is also helping communities identify what are those smart investments that they can
Right.
make that will have the potential to pay off.
Exactly.
Are you seeing large anchor institutions or employers in Rhode Island expressing a positive association with the increased resilience in communities?
Yeah, we haven't had any pushback, any resistance so far. We do hope to start engaging some of the larger private entities so that they can understand the benefits, especially the insurance industry. We would like to see them be part of our planning stages and helping us identify solutions that make sense as well. That's definitely on the table. Start reaching out to our private sector partners to see how they can help us move this along quicker.
Fascinating. It's really interesting that Rhode Island it does have exposure, but you're not at the, for example, you're not Florida, you're not Georgia, the Carolinas, right?
Right.
A place where hurricanes are an annual, every year, multiple occurrences. And it's, in some ways, you might expect the more urgent states to be leading in this, but here you really are taking advantage of the fact that you have this opportunity to create resilience.
Yeah,
Uh,
and this work started probably close to 10 years ago, where previous administrations looked at this and saw this as something that Rhode Island needed to move into. So it didn't happen overnight. It really started around 2018, 2020. I think Rhode Island was one of the first states to create the chief resiliency officer position. They put this idea on the table, so make it a policy discussion. Although we haven't had those acute events like a hurricane, like in Louisiana or Florida or North Carolina, it's just like chronic flooding events that over time accumulate and can result in big, significant damages.
Absolutely. If we think for a moment, one of the things you're doing is using this connection to public funding to be catalytic, to enable communities to act today, helping to
Mhm.
build a market, people recognizing that you increase resilience, you increase the ability to live and work in these communities that are so valuable. This is working along coastlines and along dealing with inland flooding. One can imagine something similar being put in place in areas that have fire exposure or other kinds of risk, right?
Yeah, no, we've been heard from people out west that deal with wildfires, like in Colorado and California, that this type of approach may make sense, maybe to help benefit private homeowners, to help maybe retrofit their houses, make them more resilient to fire, other things to deal with the wildfire threats as well. I understand that there's our programs up and running already out west, dealing with this revolving loan fund type concept, but maybe financing it as a different series of risks that we don't see here in New England. You know, a lot of our projects that might start off as a resiliency project, like a stormwater project, but there are community benefits from some of these projects. One of the projects we did was an old mill community that had, again, a flooding issue, but part of their solution was incorporating a bike path and a pedestrian walkway, not purely just industrial infrastructure. There's ways you can incorporate these other beautification aspects into the resiliency, make the area more resilient to deal with the flooding or whatever. Greenways and nature-based solutions are really do have many impact benefits for a community beyond just mitigating the stormwater.
Yeah, we've certainly had a chance in this format to be able to talk to people in fire or inland flooding from other sources, but we're starting to see there's a range of a spectrum of different kind of solutions that are coming to the fore. And so it's interesting to see how we might be able to put these together. And if folks are hearing about this and hearing this conversation and they think, okay, this is remarkable and we need to enable our communities to become more resilient, what can they do?
Yeah, I think it's really just talking to the local community leaders and saying, look, let's approach the state or our county government or our regional government and becoming that sort of a hub to create that financing area that can help create that critical mass and achieve that scale. Communities trying to do this piecemeal on their own is not going to be very effective. They need to have some sort of catalytic component. Things like the infrastructure bank can be replicated around the country. A lot of states already have revolving loan programs. They just have to add this other element to it and devote some capital to it, and it can be very well suited to meet these challenges. So far, we've been very fortunate that any time a bond has been offered to support the infrastructure bank, it's been overwhelmingly supported. We're hopeful that 2026 issue will also continue to garner, that popularity as well, because I think people see it's a smart investment as a high rate of return, and that the money comes back to them in that multiplier effect. So again, it's not just dollar for dollar; it's 3 or 4 times the impact.
That's great. Bill, the towns and the communities that you're talking about across Rhode Island are gorgeous, and it's a special place in the country, and it's remarkable to hear and follow along with you as you're taking these tools that really were built
Hmm.
in the last century,
Right.
and starting to apply them to the challenges we're experiencing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the proven tools are timeless, right? They can be effective in any period, just as they're implemented with the sound principles that were put in place. We expect this to be something that's around for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
That's great. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspective with us today.
Absolutely. And I enjoyed it. And you can see the sunlight coming through. I feel like I have a halo over my head.
Perfect. Perfect timing. That was a great conversation. Talking to Bill Fazioli is reminiscent of the conversation we had with Kevin Shafer and Kyle Spencer. I think all of them are examples of innovations occurring in our civic infrastructure in places that people may not expect it and they may not see it. And it's innovation that doesn't necessarily announce itself with the glitz and glamour of the latest AI startup, but they are advancing potent innovations that will have real meaningful impact on the lives of their communities around them. They are advancing potent innovations that will have a real meaningful impact on the lives of their communities around them. And I think that one of the great examples of this in this interview, Bill walks us through a community in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island has the quintessential New England communities that are coastal communities, small, charming, incredible history to them. But because they're built so close to the water, in order to get to its downtown, you need to cross over a bridge. That bridge is going to become increasingly vulnerable to flooding and being washed out with rising tides. And so that community is now using funds from the infrastructure bank to rebuild that bridge, to make it resilient so that it can withstand the kind of flooding, so that even when there's higher tides, rain events, members of that community will be able to access the critical downtown that's their commercial hub, and it's the center of so much of their own cultural and economic activity. I think a real aha moment from this conversation is the third dot and a trend in the conversations we've had recently in the podcast that helps you start to recognize a broader pattern. We see Kevin, sewerage district, institution, really adopting, recognizing that resilience is a key priority, adopting it, using the institutional capacity that they have to really advance it. We see Blue Forest, they're using mechanisms of project finance and applying it to resilience in a totally new way. Now we have Bill, who's using the institutions, the mechanisms that we have for creating infrastructure and applying that to resilient infrastructure. And what it helps you recognize is that there's so many pieces of existing infrastructure of capacity capabilities that we have in the civic infrastructure that can really be used and turned towards the question of resilience. It also gives us a little bit of a roadmap where we can start to say what other kinds of institutional capabilities and approaches and mechanisms have we already developed that we can now engage to start to advance creating more resilient communities. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.